Okay, so here's picking up our last part. So codetta, again, a diminutive of the Italian word tail, would describe the single tail, sort of at the end. But if we're talking about a long tail with lots of material, okay, it is customary to call the first terminative phrase the closing theme, and use the term codetta to describe everything else. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. And this seems to bother some students. They don't have. It's simply the idea if there are more than one terminative phrase or conidial extension, if there are multiple terminative phrases, the first is called closing theme, everything else is codetta. No great mystery that students sometimes wrestle with that concept. Okay? And it is worth noting that this closing theme often is more melodic, can even be periodic, right? It can have, although it's sort of serving the purpose of terminative phrasing, it really can also have aspects of expository phrasing. It can be thematic. You might be humming that theme. It may almost feel like a section 3 in that regard. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And in fact, I think this is one of those places that K through 33 begins to sort of deviate from perhaps the true model of sonata form, you know, where it gets a little quirky, is that this closing theme, I'll just pare it down, I gotta see the music. There's the repetition that's terminative in nature. Now, I've had students argue, and I didn't hear it for the longest time, because in my mind, carries right on through, the phrase keeps going. Mm-hmm. But I've had students argue, well, wait a second, was that not a 5/7 chord? Was that not a covered half cadence? Mm-hmm. And in my initial reaction pretty vehemently was, no, absolutely not. And then later I was like, well, maybe. I hear what you're saying.
Yeah.
And I think the reason I was disinclined to hear that as a cadence is because it didn't really fit the model of sonata form particularly well. You know, but there are other examples in which the closing theme, I think, is less open for debate. There really is a half cadence. Mm-hmm. It really is a two-phrase structure that's periodic. Mm. So I think the simple explanation is that is possible. You know, the closing theme can be periodic, if that makes sense. Period, antecedent, consequent. It can be a two-phrase structure. But it is likely to have more repeated material within the phrasing than the section 2 period, right? Mm-hmm. And I think it is liable to probably emphasize an overall 5-1-5-1-5-1 sort of structure that implies terminative function as well. Mm-hmm. But most importantly, the cadence coming into that tends to be elided PAC. Mm-hmm. And the phrase at the end of it tends to be elided PAC, which again is so even with the half cadence in the middle, the period itself is sort of demarked by these elided perfect authentic cadences, which really does give it that sense of terminative function, although it can have some periodic structure that is expository as well, if that sort of makes sense. Yeah. So when you have multiple terminative phrases, and therefore the first is the closing theme itself may actually be treated a little bit differently than these phrases that follow, if that makes sense. And so when we're sort of looking at our overall sonata model, it's important to recognize that the transition can be a dissolved period. And in fact, K333 has that sense about it. If I back all the way up to the transition, is that an imperfect authentic cadence in F? I never considered it that for the longest time because that doesn't fit the model especially well, but I did have some students that began to make that case. In other words, let me play it one more time. Is that a cadence? And this the second phrase. And I think it's a pretty strong argument. You know what I mean? I mean, that really does begin to feel like a two-phrase structure, not a single phrase structure. And so where it's convenient to say that the transition is a single phrase that modulates, it can actually be, in this case, imperfect authentic cadence in the tonic key, followed by half cadence in the dominant. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Which is itself a dissolved period, if that makes sense. So we have an antecedent, a modulating consequent, and a dissolved period because of the half cadence here. But again, transitions don't always have to end in a half cadence in the new key. They can end, I mean, they got to modulate, you know, at least in the exposition, the transition has to modulate. But we can have a perfect authentic cadence here. In which case, this isn't dissolved period. It's a real period. It's a modulating period. You know, and so it can have a sense of periodic expository function about it. It can be thematic, but most importantly, modulates. Therefore, it is transitional. And again, I think we did talk about that in the previous video about Haydn and the monothematic sonata, and how he might write a transition that is more thematic and melodic in nature than just passage work. So I mean, there are different ways of. So again, I think the important thing to recognize is that the model sonata form is not set in cement. I had one professor at Florida State who was absolutely insistent that sonata is a procedure, it's a process, it's not a form. Because in her mind, form implied, you know, literally like a concrete form, and you poured in cement, and it had to fit that.
Right.
And it's not. It's more the idea of how a piece would unfold, and then there are many, many ways in which that could be cast. And so again, Eine kleine Nachtmusik of Mozart is the only piece I found that truly, without any sort of discussion, you know, the transition is a independent, single phrase, ends in a half cadence in the new key, just like you would expect most of the time. The closing theme in Eine kleine Nachtmusik is absolutely a single phrase, not periodic, ends in the gliding perfect authentic cadence, just like you would expect. The terminative, then the single, I think it's a single phrase after that, is the codetta, ending in the perfect authentic cadence. I mean, just textbook, everything you would expect. But there are these places that things can be slightly different. The cadence at the end of the transition, whether that it could possibly be periodic, the closing theme possibly being periodic, are some differences. Okay?
Yeah.
But does this make sense in terms of closing theme and codetta and how those terms are used?
Yes.
Okay, cool. So in the Mozart 332 that you're using for your analysis, you just simply want to begin to again, find your cadences, and then begin to mark what is section 1, what is the transition, what is section 2. If there are multiple terminative phrases, what is the closing theme, that is the first of those, and then what constitutes the codetta, which would be the rest of those, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay. And if there's only one terminative phrase, then that's simply codetta. There is no closing theme.
Yeah.
As I recall, I can pretty much guarantee you there is a closing theme in 332, as I recall. If that makes sense. We haven't talked a whole lot, we've got a little bit of time, on identifying cadences and stuff. But I can give you a couple of hints. One thing to remember first and foremost check my time here, is that there are only 2 chords that support a cadence. Okay? Either a phrase ends on 5 and it's a half cadence, right? Or a phrase ends on 5/1 and it's an authentic cadence, and we're simply looking at the scale degree in the soprano and the bass to determine is it perfect or authentic, right? The way in which I'm using the word cadence, which means the end of a phrase, these are the only cadences: half, imperfect, authentic, perfect, authentic. Now, textbooks like to talk about plagal cadences, deceptive cadences, and that's a case where they really are using the word cadence to mean not the end of a phrase, but simply a chord progression, which is the other way that traditionally we have used the word cadence. Just like when you learn your cadences in piano, right, it's a chord progression that you're playing. Deceptive, well, let's do plagal cadence, quote unquote. Plagal cadence is 4/1, the amen cadence. It's the addition of 4/1 progression following an authentic cadence, which means it's not a cadence, it's cadential extension. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And so I've been very careful following some other textbooks that sort of make the same point. Plagal cadence, although we've used that term historically, if in the sort of nomenclature we're using here, actually it's incorrect. It should be plagal cadential extension, which is the term I prefer, even though that seems a little haughty. But it does impress that it functions differently from 5/1. It's the addition to a cadence, not the cadence itself, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Deceptive cadence, to me, is even a more egregious term, because what they mean by deceptive cadence, right, is when you reach what feels like the end of the phrase and then you shift to the 6th chord. This is not a cadence at all. This is actually the avoidance of a cadence, right? Because what happens is we were expecting the 1 chord that would have been a cadence, but then the 6th chord came in and the phrase continues, right? I prefer the term deceptive resolution.
So what do you do when that you're trying to look for and define periods?
Yeah, so one thing, so recognize first and foremost, a cadence is only occurring in the instance of a dominant chord or the dominant resolving to tonic.
Yeah.
Right? There are some rare exceptions when the 4 chord might resolve to a 1 chord, and that truly does have the feel of a cadence. I remember seeing one example in my graduate form class, and Bill Davis, the guy who invented the term dissolve period, suggested the term plagal half cadence. So there's one time at least you might see that.
Yeah.
I mean, it's exceptionally rare. The expectation is that, and 99.9999% of the time, only dominant and tonic chords can actually support the end of a phrase, if that makes sense.
And what about in relative minor?
Same thing.
It's the same thing.
Yeah, because you still have the dominant to tonic relationship. That relationship doesn't change.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
Yeah.
So first and foremost, remember that. The other thing that I will point out to students, particularly if you're looking at an orchestral score, follow the bass line. If you're looking at a full orchestral score, the string parts are your friends, particularly in classical period, because mostly winds simply add color, and play a very supportive role to the strings in symphonies. And your string parts, with the exception of the frustrating alto clef for the violist, right, are all in C. So there's no transposition to deal with. You just have to deal with the alto clef. But usually, given violin 1 and 2, cello and bass, you can figure out the chord and just ignore the violist all in terms of analysis, and then double check yourself. Okay, let me stop this and we'll make one more video.